the layers that the Earth is composed of. The layers of the Earth are divided into separate sections, primarily based on their density and the materials from which they are composed. If we start with the middle of the Earth, we'll start with the inner core, which, as you can see here, is solid, primarily iron, and at approximately 6,000 degrees Celsius. This next slide shows the next layer out, which is the outer core, primarily liquid iron and nickel, slightly cooler at 4,000 to 5,000 degrees Celsius. This particular layer is liquid rather than solid, mainly due to the fact that it has less pressure pushing down on it, and therefore it isn't as compressed as the inner core. Next layer, which makes up the majority of the Earth, is called the mantle. It's considered to be a semi-solid with a consistency somewhat that of, I guess you would call it molten silly putty. It has more of a solid consistency than that of a liquid, yet it can be deformed and does flow very slowly. As you can see, it's primarily composed of iron and magnesium. Again, a little cooler than the core at 2,800 to 3,200 degrees Celsius. And the upper part of the mantle, called the asthenosphere, flows much more like a liquid. As we will discuss later on, this is the semi-liquid material on which the crustal plates float and move about. And then finally, we have the crust, the outermost layer of the Earth, the one that we're the most familiar with in that we live on it. It is, of course, solid. It's composed primarily of oxygen and silicon. It's the thinnest layer. It would be somewhat comparable to the skin of an apple compared to the rest of the apple. And it consists of the uppermost section of the mantle and the crust together, making up the lithosphere. And this structure is broken up into plates, or I guess you would almost consider them to be sort of like icebergs floating on the asthenosphere, which of course leads to the theory of continental drift, which we'll be talking about later on. As we said before, these different layers are organized primarily according to density. The most dense, obviously, would be at the bottom, the least dense at the top. So if these were the densities of the various materials that the Earth was made of, which one would be at the bottom, and then rank them accordingly up toward the surface. The crust at the top at 3 grams per cubic centimeter, and then going on down to the most dense down at the bottom, which of course would be the inner core of the Earth. And of course, why are these layers in the order that they are in? Again, it primarily has to do with the density. Most of the materials that the Earth's crust is made of, as we've already seen, consist primarily of oxygen, silicon, and quite a few other elements. Nitrogen, oxygen in our atmosphere, the oceans, of course, H2O, water, plus sodium and chlorine. And then, of course, all the life on Earth, primarily consisting of carbon, phosphorus, some sulfur, oxygen and hydrogen, and very important, nitrogen for making proteins. Okay, so the majority of the Earth is, of course, made up of only a few elements from the periodic table. Most of the other elements are seen, but in much, much smaller amounts.